Location, location, location. It's a phrase you hear a lot in real estate. It emphasizes the importance of a property's location on its value, demand, and potential for appreciation. Location matters. The equivalent houses in different places can be priced differently. That's why this Advent, we're focusing on the places where the events that make up the Christmas story took place. We typically focus on the people at Christmas, but the place matters every bit as much. Location, location, location. So our journey started in Rome, where the decree was issued. Rome symbolizes those places that have power over us, have control. And that oppression creates a longing within us, a longing for what we sense is missing in our lives. And so we ask the question, what are you longing for? If it's a place that you're longing for, what is it about that place that makes you want to be there rather than where you are? And if it's a situation, what is it about that situation that's missing in your current situation? From Rome, we headed to Jerusalem, and we met Zechariah and Elizabeth at the temple. They had not been blessed with children, even though they were righteous. They had been waiting and waiting. And so we asked, what are you waiting for today? And last week, our journey took us to Nazareth, the home of Mary and Joseph. The message there was simplicity. We talked about how being raised in Nazareth shaped Jesus for ministry, and how a simple faith can fill us with grace that can be shared. So today we have reached Bethlehem, the birthplace of Jesus. In Hebrew, the word Bethlehem means house of bread. And it's believed it became that way because it's an agricultural area where a lot of wheat was grown, and later it turned into a place where they grow a lot of barley because it's drought resistant. And the village was known for its bread. Travelers that were a ways from there would stop and get their bread. Today, Bethlehem is best known, though, for being the place where Jesus was born. It's where the story that we hear this time each year took place. Bethlehem has a sense of awe attached to it. The story of shepherds and angels, a young couple, a manger, and a baby are all part of the incredible story of divine love. At that time, Bethlehem would have been crowded with all of David's descendants coming there to be registered for the census. It was so crowded that Mary and Joseph had trouble finding a place to stay, even though they had relatives there. They needed a place for Mary to give birth. Well, in recent years, Bethlehem has been filled with visitors, especially at this time of year. People come from all over the world to visit the place where Jesus was born. There's actually a church called the Church of the Nativity was built a long time ago, located on the spot where tradition holds that Jesus was born. So people line up and wait in line to get a chance to see and to touch the spot where Jesus supposedly came into this world. And there's a star there that denotes that spot. Typically, Bethlehem's decorated with lights and a tree. It's very celebratory. We went in January and they still had all the decorations up. It's a Christmas celebration that people come to experience. The Nativity, that's the tradition at the Evangelical Lutheran Christmas Church in Bethlehem, replaced their normal manger scene last year with this one. Last year, Reverend Munster Isaac preached, if Jesus were to be born today, he would be born under the rubble in Gaza. Rubble Jesus is there again this year. And this year, tourism is limited, if almost non-existent. The Gaza war is keeping them away. Bethlehem is quiet. The decorations are not up. There are no joy-filled celebrations. Last year, Isaac Talja, an Orthodox priest who ministers at the Church of the Nativity, told the congregation this in his Christmas message. Christmas is not about Santa, trees, gifts, lights, etc. My goodness, how we twisted the meaning of Christmas, how we have commercialized Christmas. Instead, he said that the Christmas message is that Jesus, who miraculously survived a massacre, you might remember Herod ordering that all the boys under the age of 2 be killed because he feared that he would lose his position of power, but Jesus and his family managed to escape. So Jesus was, he says, born among the occupied and marginalized. He is in solidarity with us in our pain and brokenness. Jesus knew what they were going through. And unfortunately, that's the Christmas message in Bethlehem once again this year. The words from the hymn, How Still We Lie, are taking on a different meaning in Bethlehem today. Location, location, location. Location matters. So, why Bethlehem? Why was Jesus born in Bethlehem? Well, the political answer is that Rome issued the decree for a census, even before Mary was expecting, as we talked about, because it probably would have taken about a year for word to get there without technology. Everyone had to go to the place of their ancestral heritage, which for Joseph was Bethlehem, the city of David. But there's a religious answer as well. Joseph was a descendant of David, and Bethlehem was the city of David. The prophet Jeremiah said, The time is coming, declares the Lord, when I will raise up a righteous descendant from David's line, and he will rule as a wise king. He will do what is just and right in the land. It's a prophecy that the future coming Messiah would be a descendant of David. That's why both Matthew and Luke include the genealogy of Jesus in their gospel. They want to be clear that Jesus fulfills that prophecy and that requirement for the Messiah. Bethlehem was large at the time of King David. You can imagine he had built quite a bit. It would have been the capital of the area. But by the time of Jesus' birth, it was a small village. There's a story of how Bethlehem became the home of David, and it's shared in the Old Testament in the book of Ruth. The story provides the spiritual meaning behind Bethlehem that gives Bethlehem spiritual meaning and points us to Jesus. The book of Ruth tells the story of a Moabite girl who married a Jewish man whose family lived in her country. Her mother-in-law was a devout woman named Naomi. After they moved, Naomi's husband died, followed not too long after by Ruth's husband, and then the husband of Naomi's other son. That left Naomi a widow, as well as both of the daughter-in-laws, Ruth and Orpah. It was a difficult situation for women to be in at that point. So Naomi urged her daughters-in-law to return to their homes. They were young enough to remarry, but the girls resisted. But finally, Orpah reconsidered, and she did return home. But Ruth refused. She vowed to remain with Naomi. The words that she spoke may sound familiar. We hear them often, sometimes at weddings. Wherever you go, I will go, and wherever you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. They're spoken from a younger woman to an older woman who were bonded in their grief. Something Ruth had experienced of the God of Israel and her in-laws motivated her to remain with Naomi and to worship the God of Naomi's people. So Ruth returns with Naomi to her homeland of Bethlehem. They were two widows with no resources. Well, Ruth found a field where the hired pickers allowed her to glean, which means to follow behind them and gather whatever they had left behind. Leviticus says, when you harvest your land's produce, you must not harvest all the way to the edge of your field, and don't gather every remaining bit of your harvest. Leave those items for the poor and the immigrant. Well, Ruth met both of those requirements. She was poor and she was a foreigner. That means that the owner was obeying the Jewish law. He was a faithful Jew. As it turns out, as the story goes on, we discover that the owner was a relative of Naomi by the name of Boaz. He learned Ruth's story and how she refused to leave Naomi, and so he showed compassion on Ruth, telling the workers to protect her, to allow her to glean beyond the limits that were set, and offering her plenty of food at mealtimes. That evening, she shared the story of her day with Naomi. Well, Naomi's response was, "May he be blessed by the Lord who hasn't abandoned his faithfulness with the living or with the dead." That's chapter 2, verse 20, which is quite a shift from the last words that we have recorded of Naomi, "The Lord's will has come out against me." Naomi's faith had been filtered by her circumstances. You know, painful situations can do that. They can block our ability to recognize God's hand at work. But now the situation has changed, and she sees a glimmer of hope. Maybe you've gone through a painful season at some point in your life, and maybe those circumstances impacted your faith. Maybe you experienced blessings during that time that, although they didn't make up for the loss that you suffered, pointed you to God and reminded you that God had not forgotten you, and that God is still at work to give you a future and a hope. Well, Rob Puquay in the book, and for this chapter, in the On the Way to Bethlehem, in this chapter, records a story that it comes from author Joyce Holliday. It tells the story of a teacher who had a specialized assignment. She taught students who had prolonged stays in the hospital. She would receive lessons from their teachers and then go to the student hospital room to tutor them. One assignment was to work with the student on nouns and adverbs. We all love that, don't we? She knew nothing about the boy's condition until she entered the room in the burn center. She discovered that he was badly burned and in intense pain. Well, the tutor composed herself and told the boy that his teacher wanted her to work with him on nouns and adverbs. The boy could barely speak, and it was all the tutor could do to stay focused on the work. She felt terrible for making the boy endure such a senseless exercise. Next morning, when the tutor came, a nurse asked her what she had done to the boy. Well, before she could even start with her apologies, the nurse explained that they had been worried about him. But since the tutor had been there the day before, his whole attitude had changed. He was fighting and was responding to treatment. It was as if he had decided to live. The boy later admitted that he had given up hope until he met the tutor. He decided that they wouldn't send a teacher to help him work on nouns and adverbs if he were going to die. There was a glimmer of hope. It was a small thing, but it made all the difference for that boy. So in the midst of a trying time, we can pray for a solution, but it doesn't always come all at once. Often it comes in small pieces, like a tutor walking in to work on nouns and adverbs. Little things can bring a glimmer of hope that leads to the next little thing that brings a glimmer of hope. Just because something that happened isn't as big as the problem doesn't mean that it isn't an answer to your prayer. Don't let it go pass you by. Accept it and see and watch for it to lead to the next. Well, after Ruth's encounter with Boaz, hope returned to Naomi. She had a new hope in Bethlehem, and not just because of the kindness of a stranger. She said, "The man is one of our close relatives. He's one of our redeemers." That is an important statement. First, we need to notice that Naomi, while talking to Ruth, said, "one of our close relatives." Naomi's no longer talking to Ruth as someone who should return to her people. She's talking to Ruth as part of her own family and someone who shares her family history. Bethlehem is not only a place where faith is restored, but also a place where everyone is included in God's provision and God's hope. Boaz was a relative, which meant that he was a kinsman redeemer. This is a provision for Israelites, especially women who fell on hard times and lost their property. When that happened, the nearest male relative served as a redeemer. Leviticus says, when one of your fellow Israelites faces financial difficulty and must sell part of their family property, the closest relative will come and buy back what their fellow Israelite has sold. The closest relative becomes the redeemer of the property. So then Naomi gives Ruth some advice on how to capitalize on Boaz's affection, which Ruth complied. And as a kinsman redeemer, Boaz would be able to take Ruth as his wife. So Boaz was a kinsman redeemer, but not the closest one. So Boaz met the man in the village square and let him know that he was the nearest redeemer relative and could buy back the property that had originally belonged to Naomi's husband. Well, the man was interested until Boaz let him know about Ruth and that he would need to marry her. The man said it would complicate the inheritance, so he forfeited his rights. He passed the right of redemption on to Boaz. So Boaz and Ruth were married, and they had a son. The women of the village said, "May the Lord be blessed, who today has left you who hasn't left you without a redeemer." The women named the child Obed, and there was a sense that the child there belonged to everyone in Bethlehem and not just to Ruth and Naomi. So Obed became the grandfather of King David. His son was Jesse, who we heard in our first scripture. So David was the king who was promised by God that he would have an heir who would be the Messiah. So the story of Ruth ends with Naomi holding her grandson. Bethlehem was a place of new life and new redemption. This is how Bethlehem became connected to David and his descendants. Given God's promise of a Messiah coming from David, it's interesting to notice that his grandmother, Ruth, wasn't Jewish. She was a Moabite woman who depended on provisions in the Jewish scriptures that called for the provision for the poor and for foreigners. So Bethlehem represents Jesus' family history. It's a history that came about because a foreigner received compassion. Jesus' genes contain racial ethnicity, immigrant assistance, religious faithfulness, and loving mercy, things that Jesus carried forward throughout his ministry. It turns out that Bethlehem provides clues to the character and values that the Messiah would display, that Jesus would model for us. There's another prophecy pointing to the coming Messiah that includes Bethlehem. It comes from the prophet Micah. "As for you, Bethlehem of Ephrathah, though you are the least significant of Judah's forces, one who is to be a ruler in Israel on your behalf will come out from you. His origin is from remote times, from ancient days." Bethlehem was considered one of the least clans of Judah. A lot of them say little. A lot of the translations say little. Even though Bethlehem was connected to King David, it was still considered to be insignificant or little. Maybe there's another reason that God chose Bethlehem as the place for Jesus to be born. Jesus came to identify with the least of society, the poor, the hurting, the brokenhearted, the little, and the insignificant. Bethlehem was selected for a reason: location, location, location. God chose places for a reason. God chose Bethlehem for a reason. God shows up in humble places in the world. Love came down at Christmas to the humble little village of Bethlehem to bring hope in an unexpected place, a place where something significant wasn't expected to happen. Jesus' love come down to earth. When followers of Jesus follow God's command to love your neighbor, love comes into the world, wherever we happen to be. When followers of Jesus help those in need, those who are hurting, those who are brokenhearted, we remind them that they are not alone. We help them to see past their current circumstances. We bring a glimmer of hope into their lives, and we help them see Jesus. Now we'll join in